And good morning and welcome today to our webinar where we're going to discuss about the common user charge and BTOM latest updates. And this is the burning topic in international trade those days. As an agenda today, we will have an introduction and we will have William and Katrina that will speak to us and they will let us know about the latest updates today. I want to tell you a bit about the Chambers Trade Academy to start with. So this is an initiative of selected chambers of commerce across the UK to provide free, short virtual sessions providing informative and educational content regarding exporting and importing. So we want to cover from the basics of trading to customs processes and latest regulations and tips about how to grow globally. So combined, we represent more than 15,000 businesses of all sizes and covering all the sectors across the UK. We support traders of all sizes and sectors and provide services for every stage of your internationalization journey, like international trade events, readiness assessments, export-import customs training courses, credit checks, bespoke advice and customs consultancy services, and many others, as you can see. Today, we'll speak about the common user charge and the BTOM latest updates. We will learn from our speakers how it will apply to imports from the EU, what type of goods are concerned, who is paying, who pays, when will invoices be raised and how frequently, how will businesses be impacted, what does it mean for inflation and consumer prices? We will also hear the British Chambers of Commerce position and how BCC responded about the new charge. And from the International Meat Trade Association, we will find what is the business perspective and how these changes affect the meat importers. And not only the meat importers, because the rules are applicable to many other companies. I'd like to welcome our speakers and to say a big thank you for their support and for their time. Our speakers today are William Bain, who is the head of trade policy at the British Chambers of Commerce. Welcome, William. And Katrina Walsh, she is the strategy director at the International Meat Trade Association. Hello, Katrina, and welcome today. Thank you for your time. Allow me now to introduce you to William Bain, our distinguished speaker who will start today's webinar. William is the head of trade policy at the British Chambers of Commerce. With his extensive expertise in trade policy, he will explain to us the overview of on the new common user charge and the BTOM. William has worked for the last 7 years with a range of companies from global retailers to SMEs, advising on EU exit, the protocol on Ireland and Northern Ireland, and the UK's new trade and investment policies. William previously spent over 10 years as an academic lawyer, specializing in constitutional and EU law, and 5.5 years as an MP, including roles as shadow ministers for DEFRA, Transport and Scotland, and membership of the Business Innovation and Skills Select Committee. William, we are all eyes and ears.
Thank you so much, Malin, and hello, everyone. Thank you for joining in such good numbers, which I think attests to the importance of the subject matter that we're going to discuss today. I think this day was always going to come when it became clear that the UK and the EU had agreed a deal for the UK to leave the EU in an orderly way, and that both sides were going to negotiate a trade deal to replace that old relationship, which would be done with much more friction in terms of trade in agri-food than had been the case for the last 50 years before that. So in that sense, although the EU introduced full controls on GB agri-food products, particularly those of animal and plant origin from day one on the 1st of January 3 years ago. This is the penultimate part of the jigsaw in terms of the UK's response to introducing that different Brexit deal. And of course, we know that this day has been deferred for 5 times as industry and different iterations of government ministers have wrestled over what could and should be done, what the state of infrastructure at our ports was, and even more importantly, the state of our digital infrastructure to allow for this change of policy to take effect. So in October, we'll see the penultimate part of the jigsaw with the extension of checks and controls to fruit and vegetable products and the introduction of safety and security certificates on imports arriving from the EU into GB. And that will be done through the rollout of the government's single trade window phase 1. But this penultimate part of the jigsaw is, of course, about checks on medium risk goods of animal origin and the associated issue of who pays for all of this new infrastructure. So there's a range of autonomous decisions that DEFRA has taken in implementing the new border pursuant to its Border 2025 plan, what has become the Border Target Operating Model, previously was the Border Operating Model. And so on Tuesday, I think it does mark a considerable change, a big move back away from the processes we saw, particularly after 1993, with the EU single market being created in the UK within that. But in terms of SPS, arguably, this is the biggest change in 50 years. So in terms of what was going to feel different from Tuesday, I think in terms of experience at the ports, the border control posts will become active for the first time. Those which are state-funded at Ashford-Sevington, covering Dover, and Eurotunnel, and then all of the privately operated and run border control posts at many of the other ports like Immingham and Portsmouth. And the government has brought in this sort of classification of goods that is familiar in other jurisdictions, including the EU, into, you know, what are high-risk goods, typically live animal movements, what are medium-risk goods, and what are low-risk goods. Now, in terms of low-risk, we have most cheeses, but not all. Medium-risk goods take in primarily meats and fish, egg, including liquid egg, milk products. And of course, we still have this discussion that we're having with DEFRA about the classification of some fruits and vegetables as well, with some potentially going into the medium risk category, which industry is questioning and seeking to change. But that's maybe for later in the year. So what we can expect is that from tomorrow, potentially goods in the medium risk category, a proportion of these could be subject to documentary and identity and physical checks at the border control post. And indeed, there'll be an obligation for all such goods to enter the UK through one of those border control posts. I think the issue that business has is twofold. One, do these processes really take account of some of the kind of just-in-time supply chains that we've become used to as consumers, purchasing range of products, whether it's chicken breasts from producers in the Netherlands or Belgium, whether it's cut flowers from the Netherlands. So the issue of 24-hour pre-notification for some of these goods is still very much contested by business. And the sense is that if we continue long term with that, it could be economically difficult for some of those suppliers and might end up with a reduced consumer experience in terms of lower shelf life. So there is a trusted trader scheme, which is meant to be in place, which will apparently make the operation of these checks on medium risk goods so much easier. And for those in that scheme, it should reduce the incidence of checks down to a very, very low single-digit percentage incidence. But for those who are not within that scheme, then potentially checks could occur on a risk-based approach, with the intention being that it is in single-digit incidence. But of course, there can be times where controls have to be ramped up, where check proportions and incidences could be higher. Now, the whole system here is really operating off the basis of a couple of new IT interfaces, one which is relatively well known to traders now because traders have been transitioning to it in terms of CDS, the Customs Declaration System, and the UK equivalent of the EU's Traces database, the UK system being IPAFS. And so since January, companies have had to pre-notify to IPAFS that consignments were coming over from the EU into GB. And in a sense, the full operation of these two databases is what we're seeing tomorrow. And the problems that industry has experienced when testing some of these, as Chamber Customs has been doing, have been several. Automatic fails leading to references to border control posts at high incidence. We know that in the last month, for example, in some of the testing that's been done, that a third of consignments processing through the beta testing have been automatically failed. And that would represent an unacceptable burden to both supply chains and port and border infrastructure. So it looks very likely that tomorrow the machinery may be turned on, but it will be operating at a low temperature. And the priority, we strongly believe from government, is going to be to accentuate flow. So I would not expect tomorrow to be seeing pictures on our television screens of large queues on the motorways developing in the vicinity of Ashford-Sevington. I think they will be moving heaven and earth in terms of the physical infrastructure, but also in the way that IPAFs and CDS operate to ensure that flow is first. So I think we may see some pinch points tomorrow when we roll that out, but I would expect to see a smoothish introduction of this new system. But of course, that will be at the expense of the full temperature of the controls not being activated. And there are significant issues with CDS and IPAFs that will need to be resolved before those databases and the whole system could be operated at the intended temperature. So that, I think, is what we'll see from tomorrow. But of course, the other major change is that companies are now liable for charge for the usage of these facilities. So, all medium risk goods and high risk goods indeed have got to come through the border control post. So tomorrow is the day in which charging begins for the payment of that service. Now, there were choices that government has had as to how this system could be introduced. The EU back in January 2021 introduced a system which was based on tonnage, which you imported into the European Union from Great Britain. So those who were importing the most paid the most in terms of the associated charges. What the government has done here is to introduce, by contrast, a flat rate system, known as the common user charge, just for those operators using Ashford-Sevington and Eurotunnel, but it's expected, of course, that the common user charge sets a precedent for the industry in the privately run ports and BCPs in other ports across Great Britain. And so the flat rate charge will mean that for a medium risk item, you will be charged at £29 per commodity line, capped at a maximum of 5 per consignment. So that leads to a maximum charge if you have salami, mozzarella, fish, liquid egg, milk, Parma ham in your consignment of £145. Of course, it is entirely possible that you may have several consignments within a lorry. And we could see companies face, if they're not able to group as efficiently as they might want to, liability for several of these charges. And costs could rise very quickly for companies. For lower risk goods, so you might have a combination of cheeses, Edam, Gouda, mozzarella, Jarlsberg. For a combination of these, up again capped to 5, it would be £10 per commodity line, so £50 overall. But if you mix your consignment with, let's say, those kinds of cheeses we talked about there, plus meats, you pay everything at the higher rate. So a mixture of the two, £29 per commodity line. So the concern that business has is that these costs are wholly novel for companies. You know, they have sitting earlier in the year doing their financial projections, they would not have expected to see costs of this sort arising so quickly. The first invoices, of course, are due at the end of July, so that will be for 3 months' charges, with monthly invoices being raised from the end of August onwards. So significant change this means for businesses who would seek to try and avoid a large increase in costs, added together with things like business rates and obviously wage pressures as well. I think we're also seeing that for many companies, and who would be surprised with the numerous pressures facing small business at the moment, awareness of these BTOM charges is not very strong either. We did a survey some 7-8 months ago, and fewer than 1 in 3 businesses actually knew what was coming next year. Now, there were choices, there still are choices about the issue of who pays and when. In its first consultation paper last spring, the government floated the possibility that those within the Trusted Trader scheme could be exempt from liability to pay the common user charge. We, in the final proposal, did not see anything of that idea. So that is something that they could look at in order to mitigate the burden that we fear is going to strike small businesses very severely indeed at the end of June, July, and every month after that. So that's one practical thing that they could do now. Longer term, clearly what the problems and the hassle that businesses on both sides of the English Channel and Irish Sea will experience in getting goods to the other market does illustrate again why having a more fundamental solution seems the best answer here. And so the BCC's position for some time, emphasised by what's happening this week, is that we should look to have a veterinary agreement with the European Union. That should be as expansive as we can possibly negotiate between the UK government and the European Commission. That would have the effect of reducing some of these costs of doing trade in terms of agri-food. It may not eliminate everything, It certainly won't eliminate things like customs declarations and all of that element of red tape, but clearly, if we were expansive enough, we could do a lot in terms of reducing the burdens over export health certificates, the common user charge, and also the incoming safety and security certificates burdens as well. So that would be our sense, Malin. Great time to speak to your local chamber, to speak to IMTA, get the best possible advice, be speaking to your customs agents and freight forwarders if you're a small business. Don't wait until the end of July when those big invoices are going to drop. Take actions now if you can to mitigate your exposure to the charge. Look to group as appropriately as you can in order to cut your potential charges. Have a look at the business model in terms of when you should be importing, when is the optimal time, how much can you import in perhaps larger consignments. That could be an option as well. But having a good plan to mitigate and be aware of what's coming and to make sure that it operates in a way that's least disruptive to yourself, to your suppliers, and to your customers is going to be key. And I think if we can do those things together with speaking to government about the short term and the longer term policy routes to resolve these new challenges, then we'll be in as good a place as we can be in these coming weeks, months, and years.
Thank you very much, William. So this webinar is under Chamber Trade Academy, so it will be seen in whole UK. And if you have any questions, just ask your local chamber, because they can be in contact with William and with other people that can give you the answers. Thank you very much, William. Let's go forward. It was great to hear from you, William. And now, please allow me to introduce you to our distinguished guest from the International Meat Trade Association, Katrina Walsh. Katrina Walsh is the IMTA Strategy Director. She previously was the Policy Director. She started her career in Brussels at the European Meat and Livestock Meat Trade Union before joining the IMTA in 2016. Katrina has recently completed an MSc, a Master in Science in Food Regulatory Affairs, building on her academic background in European politics. Katrina has a particular interest in international trade, and if we are talking about international, Katrina speaks French, Spanish, and Danish, and in 2022, she took a career break, which she spent traveling in South and Central America. So that's a very interesting. Katrina, the floor is all yours.
Yes, thank you very much for having me come along today to talk about some of members' concerns about the BTOM and the common user charge. I've already had my introduction, so I won't introduce myself again. The next slide talks a bit about who we are at IMTA. We're a two-way trade association representing importers and exporters. Our members are predominantly UK companies, and our goal is to facilitate the two-way trade in meat, ensuring UK consumer choice, food security, and carcass balance. And we provide leading trade expertise to our members on things like customs, tariffs, quotas, SPS conditions, and trade agreements. We have 65 trading members and 25 associate members. So those are companies that aren't directly trading meat, but that are involved in the meat space. So for instance, freight forwarders or shipping lines. I'll go to the next slide, please. I just wanted to share with those on the call today a bit about why two-way traded meat is so important and why we import and export. So these graphics that we produce show that the cuts that we import aren't the same as what we export generally. So you can see there that we're importing on the beef side, steaking cuts and fore and hindquarter, because that's what's demanded by the UK consumer. And then we're exporting things that are less popular on the UK market, like liver, kidney, tongue, tripe. and we're exporting those to markets around the world that very highly value that. And that enables the UK to have food security and also for producers to benefit from access to export markets. So you can scan the QR code there to see more. And we have diagrams like this across the 4 species of meat that we mostly trade in. So I'll now move on to what the changes are that are happening in April on the next slide. So this is just an overview of the changes as relates to meat, which is generally a medium risk product from the EU. So you'll see the documentary checks move from the central hub to the port health authorities. So it will actually be the official veterinarians looking at those export health certificates for the first time from tomorrow. And I think, as William referred to, EU goods will have to enter via a port with a suitably designated border control post. We'll see the physical checks, which could include sampling start. And there are also changes for the rest of world, which I just wanted to highlight because we're focused a lot on the EU, but actually there are some changes to the countries that we're importing from more internationally. So they have to use the streamlined certificates from tomorrow, and they will see a reduced level of checks, particularly around identity checks. So moving to the next slide. These are our key concerns that the BTOM has, kind of thrown up for members. So I'll go through these one by one. One of them is on central hub feedback. So some members have expressed concerns that the feedback they've been receiving on their export health certificates from the central hub hasn't really been detailed enough to actually make the changes based on. And there are some concerns about the accuracy of that feedback. And some haven't actually had any checks at all or a very low sample. So they haven't had the opportunity to actually act on any feedback yet. So it will be interesting to see what happens when the vets are doing those documentary checks from tomorrow. There is a huge implication on charges and costs, and I have a couple of slides specifically on that, so I will come on to that. On systems readiness, I think William already referred to this, the IPAFs and CDS systems, so the veterinary and the custom side, those both have to work together through the ALVS link to actually allow release of the goods. And we do have some concerns about the readiness of those systems. We really do need some more assurances that they are going to stand up to the volume of goods that we import from the EU, as if we have any falling over of that system or outages, that could cause delays and major issues for importers. So that is something we will be watching quite closely. Then on sampling, these physical checks that are starting could include taking samples of the product and sending off for analysis. And we have particular concerns in relation to this for chilled product, because the meat that we import from rest of world currently under the import regime tends to either be frozen meat or red meat with a long shelf life for even chilled product, whereas the products we import from the EU tends to be chilled and can include things like chilled poultry meat, for instance. And we previously had a memorandum of understanding with the port health authorities dealing with this rest of world import. And they provided us with some information on turnaround times for different kind of testing, whether that's residue testing or microbiological testing. And in certain instances on those microbiological tests, because you need to actually culture the sample you take, it can take several days before you get the result back. So we're very concerned what happens to, for instance, chilled poultry meat in instances where it has to be held before the sample comes back, what that means for shelf life, because we know from members, their feedback is that even losing 1 day shelf life on a product like that is massively impacting their commercial relationships and ability to deliver on time and meet consumer expectations. So we are really worried in cases where you're losing a few days, what that actually means for the future of that product. So we need some assurances that that's being thought through, what the implications are. In terms of issues that come up, from tomorrow when these physical checks and ID checks come in, we feel like there needs to be a route for traders to go to DEFRA where there are instances of differences of opinions or uncertainty about policy. And I understand that DEFRA says that traders can only go to the PHSA in that instance, but I think there needs to be a route to actually go to DEFRA as well, particularly to talk about instances where pragmatism needs to be shown. So I think that is a bit absent and needs to be thought through more. On the pragmatic approach, we've seen DEFRA commenting a lot publicly about taking this pragmatic approach, but we haven't really seen much detail on what that actually means and what it will look like and in what instances pragmatism will be offered. And I think it's really important for our importers to have some sense of security on that, as well as to the suppliers in the EU, that they understand that some pragmatism will be offered and in what circumstances, because the last thing we want is for them to be put off trading with the UK and think, well, I'll just trade with the EU. I don't want to deal with, all of the potential risks of trading with the UK market. And that would obviously have a really negative impact on our food security if that was the case. So I think we need some better comms on the pragmatism. And we need an extended educational approach to actually protect those relationships and protect food security. I will then come on to talking about the common user charge on the next slide. I think this is an area where some traders have been caught a bit off guard because we were waiting for so long for the common user charge level to be published, and that was gaining a lot of attention, that some people didn't actually realize that the common user charge doesn't cover the PHA charges or the inspection fees. So they're now realizing that there are additional charges in relation to what they thought there would be, and they're having to set up multiple accounts in order to pay these fees. And even as late as last week, some port health authorities or BCPs hadn't actually announced what the charges would be or what the mechanism for paying them would be. So that's created a huge amount of administrative burden on companies, having to go around trying to find out what the fees are, having to set up multiple payment accounts. And that's all adding costs into the system. And I think a lot of this was caused by the late notice of the changes, particularly on the common user charge. I'll look at the next slide on the disproportionate impact on small companies. So when small companies import from the EU, they might not be importing enough product to justify hiring a whole truck. So they use a groupage model whereby there can be multiple owners transporting product on the same truck. And the issue with that is in relation to these charges is that if you're importing just a couple of pallets on a truck, you still have to pay all of these charges. And I've listed the different types of charges that an importer of meat could face. Whereas a bigger company that can afford to hire, a whole truck to transport a much bigger load, when you divide out those charges by kilo on the product and how much more expensive that's ultimately going to be, the small companies are hit a lot harder by this because they're paying these charges and dividing it onto a smaller amount of product. So there's a very disproportionate impact on the small companies, which I think really isn't that fair and potentially indicates that the design of this hasn't really been thought through or taken into account the extra costs that small companies are facing. So in the information on costs that government has released, I think this hasn't been taken into account. And there's also the fact that companies might have to put on extra staff at different times in order to ensure that they have people available to upload certificates or deal with any issues at certain times. And that also hits the small companies disproportionately. I'll talk a bit about pre-notification on the next slide. So I think William referred to this 1 working day pre-notification requirement. And this, in our opinion, really doesn't work for import from the EU because the transit times are extremely short. So if you're importing product from, say, the Netherlands or France, those transit times are so short that having to notify 1 working day in advance doesn't work because the vet will certify and load the product. And then is there an expectation that the truck should just hang around until 24 hours has passed? Obviously, that's not viable for all sorts of reasons around driver's hours, shelf life, things like that. So there is an ability to request a derogation down to 4 hours, but businesses have to approach each individual BCP they're importing through to request a derogation, and that might not be granted in every instance. So this is definitely something that we're looking at because it doesn't really work on this model. So the next slide, I think, talks about just our outstanding questions. So I'll not go through all of these because I think I've touched on most of them already. But the main point I want to highlight is that, this regime is coming in tomorrow and we still have all of these outstanding questions. And despite us having quite a few Q&As for members organized with DEFRA in order for members to be able to ask their questions and get answers, some of those questions haven't been able to be answered yet. And we actually have a meeting with DEFRA Minister Lord Douglas Miller this afternoon to try and get some answers. But we're left in a situation where we have virtually no time left with the regime coming in tomorrow, and there's still all of these questions. So that concludes my presentation. I hope it was interesting for everyone.
Thank you very much, Katrina. Yes, it was very interesting. Thank you very much. And now, if you don't mind, I'll read you some questions because people are very curious to find out more. One of the questions is coming from one of our participants. How are ports going to manage the checks and releasing shipments? Some are well behind already with their checks of containers, and this can lead to spoiled produce because of such delays. Did any of you speak with the port authority, or do they have a plan, the people from the government? William, Katrina?
Well, it's interesting that we have a sort of, excuse me, Malin, a sort of constant array of messages coming from DEFRA, but still less than 24 hours to go, a whole range of questions that still have to be answered in terms of how the reality of tomorrow and the days afterwards is really going to operate. Short answer is I think the government has various tactics about how to manage the situation from tomorrow onwards. I think the key one will be to dial down or dial up as appropriate. But I think really for the foreseeable future, it will be to keep at a very low level the incidence of physical checks. You know, and I think one of the approaches they may well take is to look at whether it's appropriate over groups of commodities. So, you know, over things like chicken or pork imports, you know, can you dial up the controls and have everything operate entirely smoothly as it's intended to without intervention from government to keep the checks artificially low? And I think they will take a commodity by commodity approach to this. So I think they will only dial up the actual check regime when they're confident that the ports will be able to handle it, and particularly Dover and Eurotunnel. And the other thing that, of course, comes into this as well for importers, you know, for the private run BCPs, they're not going to be open 24/7. So if you have sort of particularly sensitive supply chains and you really need to get, you know, goods to your market stall for the following morning, it's going to direct, I think, even more of that traffic through Dover and the BCP at Ashford 70. So again, I think that places a priority on the government overall in their sort of gold command, which is overseeing all of this, to prioritize flow. So I think we're going to see that for quite some considerable period until they're confident that all parts of this system are capable of being stood up without requiring significant intervention from government.
I could add a bit on that if that helps. I think as William indicated, you know, DEFRA is saying that they're going to check what they consider to be the highest risk goods, which gives them quite a bit of leeway to move the levels of checks up and down, and introduce incrementally, as they've talked about this kind of staging. But one thing I would be concerned about is that the documentary checks, so that's the checks on the export health certificates, are moving to the responsibility of the PHAs, which requires a lot of veterinary resource to carry out all of those documentary checks. So we are concerned that maybe that resource isn't going to be able to deliver 100% of documentary checks, which is the intention of government. So I think that's something also to consider, that it's not just the goods that are physically being called to the BCP, but actually those documentary checks happening remotely is also a concern.
Thank you, Katrina. It is a concern. I've got two questions that are quite similar. Dover Port Health Authority is currently not approved for meat products or products of animal origin. I'm not sure, is this the case?
So I think Sevington received its approval I think perhaps on Friday, the government webpage officially was updated to say that it did have status as a border control post. And I think that does cover products of animal origin. So that designation did happen extremely late in the day, but as I understand, it has now happened.
Yeah, that's great, because two of the questions were asking the same thing. Will this port be ready for the products of animal origin? This is amazing. Thank you for answering this one. Now, somebody's asking about the invoicing. Uh, could you please confirm who will be collecting the common user charge? And is the importer the importer of record who will be invoiced, or will be the agent? So my understanding is that the common user charge, it will be the people, the companies, the importers will be charged in July for whatever they import starting from now, and whoever will complete the IPAFs, the first IPAFs in 30th of March or after, that person, that entity will be the one that will be charged. Is this a good understanding that I have?
So DEFRA did release a kind of circular email on Friday from the BBTP, and they said that the common user charge guidance on billing details had been updated, and that about payments for invoices where an agent acts on behalf, and that in these circumstances, the agent will need to provide their billing details for IPAFs and receive one invoice covering all pre-notifications for all CHEDs raised in the invoicing period, and be responsible for paying the common user charge. So hopefully that helps address that question.
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
so.
I think speaking to quite a few of smaller restaurants, stroke delis in the last couple of weeks, those that use their customs agent or freight forwarder were on being informed about the nature of what was to come, going to have urgent conversations with them about all of that. But look, ultimately, this cost is going to have to be borne by the people who are importing, the people who are making the meats into finished product for sale here. And that's why the OBR and the Bank of England have published analyses reflecting the sort of 0.2% uplift over 3 years in consumer prices. You had the Allianz report a couple of weeks ago, which indicated the uplift in cost and reduction in trade, which could flow from the introduction of this control regime. So it's the consumer who will pay ultimately.
Thank you. And another one for you, William. How is the government going to support small businesses with costing of these new processes? This could lead to monopolization, price gouging from larger companies. Concerned that this will have a larger impact on cost of living, product pricing, or willingness for EU imports. It's a serious question. Is there anything from the government saying that they are planning to, do they have on the back of their minds the small companies importing products that are affected?
Well, they're publishing guidance, they're doing Q&As, as both of us have pointed out. But in terms of actually coming up with a plan to mitigate the shock for what could be quite large bills, either faced directly by the importer or passed on to them from their customs agent, there is no plan about how business is going to react to this. And given the scale of lack of knowledge of this, which is still persistent, because there hasn't been the same kind of comms campaign we saw in 2019 or 2021. We do need steps from government which can mitigate the impact of this on small businesses. We're talking about the corner shop, a small restaurant, a small delicatessen, businesses operating on a small margin, 2-3% margin, and who simply don't have the cash flow or the other capacity to manage a huge shock to their finances, which the BTOM charges could represent. I think it's also clear there's been no real advice or strategy from government in terms of how small businesses might mitigate the scale of the charges. It's all been technical advice about here's who gets charged and when, but there's a lot more they could have done around groupage, which again could have mitigated the impact of this on small and medium-sized delis, cafes, and restaurants.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. It is what it is, the new charge. Now, I've got another question that is quite similar. If goods are held for inspection and tests, and the test results are fine, who compensates the importer for lost revenue due to the product losing shelf life? I know for a fact that for poultries, my customers, if they are delayed, they will need to support extra cost or getting a reduced value for the goods when they are delivered if they have a lower amount of days left for shelf life. The question is very genuine from our attendee today, but is something from the government saying that they are looking to do something about this? Do they guarantee a certain amount or period of time that companies can work with?
So I can only talk about meat, so it might be different for other products. But I think if goods are pulled for sampling as part of the general routine checks, then the government wouldn't place a hold on those. So the importer could, progress that into the supply chain. There obviously would be issues if the results come back and something unfortunately was found and having to recall that product. If the sampling is done on the basis of a suspicion or as part of an intensified official controls due to, for instance, previous failed tests, then the border control post would hold those goods until the sample result was known, which, as the person that asked the question indicates, could be several days, and shelf life would be being decreasing during that time, assuming it was a chilled product. As far as I know, there isn't any intention to offer any financial recompense to the importer in those cases. As far as I know, there's not anything along those lines, unfortunately. And there is obviously the impact on the value of the product, but also considering the commercial relationship with the importer and the person they're ultimately supplying, missing delivery slots, product that was intended for processing. If that doesn't reach the processing facility, then obviously there's implications on labor and things there. So there are a lot of implications that need to be thought through.
Thank you. William, do you have something to add to this? Or if not, I can go to the next question, which is quite interesting. So if a trailer is pulled for a physical check, who will be responsible to pay the port charges for the checks? Is it the haulier or the importer who has the goods on the trailer? So I would like to clarify something for myself too. So the common user charge will be paid by the importer or the agent, and this is nothing to do with the checks themselves. The check will be invoiced by the port operator directly to the importer of records. Is that correct?
I think how the charges are paid could vary by PHA, so I couldn't say for everything, but I think ultimately the cost of the checks would be passed on to the importer themselves.
It will always be the importer. Actually, the final price will be paid by the final buyer. So this is what it's quite sad to know and to find out. It seems that we run out of time, and what I will suggest is to watch the space. On 15th of May, we'll have another webinar focusing on the trade with Egypt. I would like to thank to Katrina and William for being with us today and giving us so many valuable answers. Thank you. And to everybody, have a lovely day and good luck from tomorrow on with those new charges, the new rules for BTOM. Thank you very much and have a lovely day. Thank you,
Thank you.
Katrina. Thank you, William.